Before this night is over, something in you will die and something greater will rise. The fear that has haunted you will be dissolved. The chains of old belief will break. This is not a wish, but a law. The spoken word you hear tonight will rewire your destiny completely. In this session, you will saturate your mind with the very laws that govern wealth, health, and divine timing. Where the world has written defeat, this recording will inscribe victory. Where fear has whispered lack, you will hear prosperity proclaimed. For the next few hours, you will no longer be at the mercy of your thoughts. You will be aligning with divine law itself. This is not background noise. This is the vibration that multiplies money, restores peace, and opens the secret door to your success. I know you've tried to force results with effort, with willpower, with sleepless worry. You've read the books, said the affirmations, maybe even begged the heavens. But tonight, you are not striving. You are surrendering to the higher law that has already declared your victory. You will hear stories, affirmations, and decrees that countless others have used to manifest money, health, and love against all odds. You'll see why nothing has been working, and why everything begins to work when you align with the spoken word. Here's how we'll move together. First, I will speak the eternal principles so you understand why your words carry creative power. Then, you will hear affirmations that erase fear and plant prosperity. As the hours unfold, these truths will repeat until your subconscious yields, until your inner record is rewritten. By morning, you will not rise the same. Somewhere in the night, the old programming will die and the new life will rise. Stay until the end, for the words I give you are not mine. They are divine law, and they cannot return void. Listen closely, because what I'm about to say is the turning point of your life. Life is not a battle. That lie has worn out your body and mind. Life is not a fight to survive, nor a struggle to push through. Life is a game, a divine game of giving and receiving, of sowing and reaping, of speaking and manifesting. And like any game, you cannot win if you don't know the rules. Here is the rule you must never forget. Your word is law. Every sentence you speak goes out as a living seed. Every idle word, every complaint, every fearful joke, it all takes root in the soil of the subconscious. And the subconscious does not argue. It does not say, well, she didn't really mean that. No. It is a perfect recording device, capturing without pause, replaying without judgment, and it will hand you back the record you impressed upon it. Do you see why I say your life today is nothing but the echo of what you spoke yesterday? Now, most people go through life cutting bad records. They speak of lack, so they live in lack. They speak of sickness, so they grow sick. They speak of loneliness, so their homes grow empty. And then they wonder, why me? Why does this always happen to me? But I tell you, it happens because you wrote it with your own tongue. That is why I say the spoken word is not suggestion. It is law. Here's something most people completely miss. The subconscious cannot take a joke. Let me tell you of a woman who used to amuse herself as a child by dressing in black and pretending to be a widow. Everyone laughed at her little performance, but the subconscious did not laugh. It recorded her play acting as law. Years later, she fell in love, married, and soon after her beloved husband died, leaving her the widow she had pretended to be. Do you see it? The game of life cannot be mocked. What you rehearse in word or image, you eventually perform in your affairs. Another woman, wealthy and comfortable, would often sigh and say, "I'm so tired of managing things. I feel like I live in a trunk." It was her little expression, a joke she repeated many times. Soon enough, her fortune dwindled, her home was lost, and she found herself quite literally living out of a trunk. Her own word had created her prison. Now, maybe you think, well, that's extreme. That could never happen to me. But ask yourself, what are the little phrases you repeat without thinking? I'm broke. This always happens. I never get ahead. These careless words are writing your story. They are weaving your garments. And if you don't like the garments you're wearing, it is time to change the pattern. Let me show you the contrast. A woman once came to me in despair. She had only $8 to her name. Worn down, discouraged, she said, "I can't see any way forward." I told her, "Good. We will bless the $8 and we will multiply it. For Jesus Christ taught that each man has the power to bless and multiply, to heal and to prosper." I spoke over her. Infinite Spirit, open the way for great abundance. She is an irresistible magnet for all that belongs to her by divine right. She obeyed her intuition, followed her inner hunch, and within a short time she received thousands in a most unexpected way. She would later tell me, "Tell them about the woman with $8 and a hunch. She had discovered the law. Words of blessing multiply. Words of despair reduce." This is why I say to you, stop rehearsing your defeats and begin rehearsing your triumph. If you don't like the record you've been playing, break it, smash it, and make a new one right now. Say aloud with me, "I now smash and demolish every false record in my subconscious mind. They return to their native nothingness. I now make new and perfect records. Records of health, wealth, love, and perfect self-expression." Pause. Feel the power of those words. They are not mere sounds. They are electric currents impressing themselves on the invisible substance that shapes your world. Now you may say, "But Florence, I've said affirmations before and nothing happened. I've tried to speak positively, but life still looks the same." Do not be deceived by appearances. A record does not stop spinning because you say so once. You must break it and replace it. Persist until the new sound is all that plays. For just as a song can play on repeat until it fills a room, your words can play on repeat until they fill your life. Let me give you a picture. Imagine the subconscious as a great phonograph in the sky. Every word you speak etches a groove into the record. Deep grooves play the loudest. Shallow grooves fade quickly. Which grooves have you been etching? Fear, lack, or truth? If you have been carving lack into the record for years, do not be surprised when the music of poverty plays back to you. But here is the good news. One groove of truth spoken with faith and repeated until it becomes the loudest song will erase the old tune. That is the law. So tonight, as you listen, I ask you, what record will you play? The record of fear or the record of faith? The record of lack or the record of plenty? The record of loneliness or the record of divine companionship? Speak it now. Say with me, "I now play the record of health, wealth, love, and perfect self-expression." I hear only the sound of victory. Do you feel it shifting? That's the reprogramming already beginning. Not by effort, not by willpower, simply by the spoken word, the word of law, the word of truth. Now that we have smashed the false record, let us move into the new song of prosperity. Because once you break the old record, you must inscribe a new one. And prosperity is your divine right. Now that the old record has been smashed, we must inscribe the new one. And what is the new record? Prosperity. Not as the world teaches it through endless striving and fear of loss, but as divine law declares it. God is your unfailing supply. Every demand already carries within it its supply. Every true desire is already provided for before you even ask. Here's what most people completely miss. They think prosperity is something to earn. They think it's a paycheck, a deal, a hustle, a chance encounter. But let me tell you plainly, prosperity does not come from your employer. It does not come from a client. It does not come from luck. Prosperity comes from God. God is the source and every other channel is simply an instrument. And when one instrument closes, God opens another. Why does this matter so much? Because if you tie your prosperity to a person, a job, or a business, then the moment that channel closes, fear takes hold. You begin to tremble, saying, "What will I do now? Where will my supply come from?" And in that trembling, you shut the door to your good. But when you know God is your supply, you become fearless. You know that if one door shuts, Another is already opening. You know that what belongs to you cannot be withheld, because it is written in divine law. Let me give you a picture. A woman once came to me in deep distress. She was about to be sued for $3,000 and the date was fixed. She saw no way out. She said, "Florence, I have no money. What can I do?" I told her. God is your supply, and there is always supply for every demand. I spoke the word. I give thanks that she has received $3,000 in the right time and the right way. Now, listen carefully. The 15th, the day she was to be sued, arrived and still no money. She called me in fear. I said, "It is Saturday. They cannot sue you today. Act rich. Show your faith." I went to lunch with her and I said, "Order the most expensive thing on the menu. Show the law that you already have your supply." That evening, she telephoned me again, this time with great excitement. "A miracle has happened." She cried. Her cousin, whom she had not seen in years, had suddenly visited her. As he was leaving, he asked about her finances. When she confessed her need, he said, "Why? I will give you $3,000 on the 1st of the month." The very next morning he called again and said, "Come to my office today. I will give you the money now." And so she had the exact sum in perfect timing, in perfect ways. Do you see the lesson? When you speak the word of prosperity, you must act as though it were already done. That is digging your ditches. For Elisha told the kings, "Why shall not see wind, neither shall ye see rain, yet make this valley full of ditches?" They dug the ditches before there was a drop of water, and the ditches were filled to overflowing. Faith acts before it sees. Another woman once came to me during a severe housing shortage in New York. Everyone said it was impossible to find an apartment. Friends pitied her, saying, "You will have to put your furniture in storage and live in a hotel." But she replied, "You need not feel sorry for me. I am a Superman and I will find my apartment." She spoke the word. Infinite Spirit, open the way for the right apartment. Then came the test. She had planned to buy blankets, but the reasoning mind whispered, "Don't buy them. You may not find an apartment. You'll waste your money." But she answered boldly, "I'll dig my ditches by buying the blankets." She acted her faith, and soon she had her apartment miraculously, even though over 200 others applied for it. Can you feel it? Faith prepares for the blessing before it appears. Faith spends the money before the money arrives, because it knows the money is already on the way. And here is one of my favorite stories. A woman came to me with only $2 to her name. I told her to bless the $2 for blessing multiplies. I said, "You have the magic purse of the Spirit. It can never be depleted. As money goes out, more comes in under grace in perfect ways." I described it so vividly. I see your purse crammed, jammed with money, with bills, with checks, with gold and silver, that she felt her purse heavy with wealth. She believed it so deeply. She even gave me one of her last $2 as an offering. Not long after, she was gifted $6,000. Do you see? That is not luck. That is law. So I ask you now, how have you been speaking about money? Have you been calling it hard to get? Have you been telling stories of lack and struggle? If so, you are writing that into your record. But you can change it this very moment. Let us speak together. God is my unfailing supply in large sums of money. Come to me quickly under grace in perfect ways. Say it until your bones know it. Say it until the walls of your home echo with it. For money is not your master. It is your servant. And when you bless it, it multiplies. Now you may be thinking, "But Florence, isn't it irresponsible to act rich when I have so little?" I tell you, it is more irresponsible to act poor when you are the child of a king. For the kingdom of heaven is within you, and that kingdom has no lack. When you bless what you have, when you act in faith, when you prepare your blankets, dig your ditches, and bless your purse, you prove the law, and the law proves itself to you. So tonight, as you rest, let this record play. Every bill I bless multiplies, Every dollar I spend returns to me increased. I am an irresistible magnet for all that belongs to me by divine right. My ships come in over a calm sea. Money flows to me in avalanches of abundance under grace in perfect ways. That is powerful enough on its own. But combine it with what I'm about to show you next, and you will see why prosperity sometimes seems blocked. For prosperity cannot flow where fear dams the stream. Fear is the only enemy, and we must deal with it now. Now that you've spoken prosperity into being, let me tell you the truth that will keep it flowing. Fear is your only enemy. Not people, not circumstances, not lack. Fear. For fear is nothing but faith turned upside down. It is faith in evil instead of good. And as surely as faith draws in supply, fear draws in disaster. Here's something most people completely miss. Every time you tremble over a bill, you are praying for lack. Every time you picture failure, you are rehearsing it into form. Every time you voice your fear, you are writing a command for it to appear. Jesus Christ said, "Why are ye fearful? O ye of little faith?" He knew the truth. Fear is inverted faith, and it is the only force that can keep you from your good. Let me show you how serious this is. I once knew a brilliant man who was plagued by worry. Every decision, every venture, he was tormented by the fear of what might go wrong. His mind was full of what-ifs. Then one day he read a simple sign on the wall, "Why worry? It will probably never happen." Those words pierced his subconscious. He stopped rehearsing disaster and began expecting good. From that day forward, his life turned. He said to me often, "Florence, that one sentence erased fear from my life." And when fear was gone, good rushed in. Let me give you another picture. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. By all appearances, it was the end. But Daniel did not tremble. He did not cry, "What if they devour me?" He stood still in faith. And God shut the lions' mouths. They became as harmless as kittens. That is not just a Bible story. It is law. Your lions, whatever they may be, are only dangerous when you fear them. Walk up to them in faith, and you will find angels in armor. Now let me tell you of a woman who learned this in a very practical way. She was traveling by sea when a thick fog set in. The ship was halted. The passengers grew restless. She remembered the truth. There are no fogs in divine mind. She declared it, "There are no fogs in divine mind. I give thanks for the sun." Within a short time the fog lifted and the sun shone clear. What others called weather she knew as consciousness. What others accepted as a problem, she dissolved with truth. Why does this matter for you? Because many of you have been affirming prosperity, while secretly entertaining fear. You bless the purse with one hand and clutch it with the other. You say, "God is my supply." But in the night, you rehearse the disaster, and then you wonder why your good seems delayed. But I tell you, fear dams the stream. Faith breaks the dam. So how do you dissolve fear? Not by wrestling with it, not by analyzing it, by replacing it. Replace it with praise. Replace it with thanksgiving. Replace it with the bold declaration of truth. For fear cannot live where praise abides. Say it with me now. I walk up to the lion and find an angel in armor. I am fearless, for God is with me. I stand still and I see the salvation of the Lord. Do you feel it? The shift from trembling to triumph. That is not suggestion. That is law. And when you learn to hold your poise in the face of fear, the battle is already won. Now you might be thinking, "But Florence, what if I feel the fear anyway? What if it still rises in me?" Then I say, act as though you were fearless, and the feeling will follow. Speak the word even when your knees shake, for the word is the seed, and the seed will grow even in trembling hands. Here is the secret. Fear is only the shadow of doubt. Shine the light of faith and the shadow vanishes. Stand still, give thanks, and the victory is yours. That is powerful enough on its own. But combine it with what I am about to reveal, and you will see why some people live in constant breakthrough, while others remain locked out. For when fear is gone, the walls of your Jericho must crumble. And behind those walls lies the secret door to your success. When fear is dissolved, the walls of your Jericho begin to tremble. And just behind those walls lies the treasure you've been seeking, your divine success. But here is the mystery. Everyone wants success. Yet most never pass through the secret door. They push against it. They beg for it. They circle around it. But the door does not open. Why? Because the lock is not outside. It is inside. And the key is not effort. It is consciousness. Here's what most people completely miss. Success is not a matter of chance, talent, or hard work. It is a matter of alignment. For each one of you, there is already a divinely designed success. A place no one else can fill, a work no one else can do. But the entrance to it is often blocked by walls of resentment, envy, discouragement, or idle talk. You build your own Jericho, and then wonder why you cannot enter. Let me give you a picture. I once knew a woman who was eaten up with envy because a friend had received a beautiful gift. She fumed. Why her and not me? That wall of resentment shut her out from her own good. I told her to speak this word. What God has done for others, He now does for me and more. She obeyed, and soon after she received the exact gift her friend had received, plus an additional present. Do you see it? Envy shuts the door. Gratitude and praise open it. Another wall is discouragement. I remember meeting a young man selling programs outside a theater. Most people ignored him, and he was tempted to give up. But he looked at me and said, "You know, most people give up just before something big is coming. A successful man never gives up." Within weeks, he had moved into a new job he loved. His wall of Jericho crumbled because he refused to be discouraged. And sometimes the wall is simply too much talking. I once knew a man of great ability who could never succeed. Why? Because every night he went home and told his family every detail of his business, his hopes, his fears, his doubts. He scattered his forces with idle words. I told him, "Silence is golden. Don't discuss your affairs." He obeyed, and not long after, he was given a position at a fine salary, which grew into even more. He had stopped scattering his power and began concentrating it. Now, let me show you the law of preparation, for success demands faith in action. One of my students longed to travel abroad, but had no money. He spoke the word, "I give thanks for my divinely designed trip, divinely financed under grace in perfect ways." And then, in faith, he bought a trunk. It was a bright, happy trunk with a red band. Every time he saw it, he felt the trip was already his. Soon the money arrived, and the trip came to pass, perfect in every detail. The trunk had been his act of faith, his oil in the lamp. That is why Jesus told the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. The foolish ones had lamps with no oil, no preparation, no faith in action. The wise ones carried oil, and when the bridegroom came, they were ready. So I ask you now, are you carrying oil in your lamp? Have you bought your trunk? Have you dug your ditches? Have you prepared your field? For only those who prepare in faith step through the secret door when it opens. Now you may be wondering, but Florence, what if I don't know where my door is? What if I don't see any opportunity? That is the beauty of divine law. You don't have to see the door. You only have to shout down the wall. And what shout am I speaking of? The shout of faith. The children of Israel circled Jericho 7 days. On the 7th day they shouted and the walls fell flat. That is the power of affirmation. Speak it until your own wall crumbles. Say it with me now. The walls of lack and delay now crumble away, and I enter my promised land under grace. Pause. Feel the wall falling. See yourself stepping over the rubble into the city of your good. That picture is not imagination. It is prophecy. For what you picture and speak with faith must come to pass. So here is the golden thread of this section. Resentment, envy, idle talk, and discouragement build walls. Praise, gratitude, silence, and preparation tear them down. Behind the wall lies your city of success. And you do not have to force your way in. You need only to speak the word, carry the oil, and act as if it were already done. That is powerful enough on its own. But combine it with what I am about to share, and the way becomes clear. For once the door opens, you must know how to follow the invisible guide, the still small voice. And that is where we turn next to intuition, the magic path that never fails. Now that the walls of Jericho have crumbled, and the secret door is open, you must know how to walk the path beyond it. And here is the last truth I will leave with you tonight. The magic path is intuition. Here's something most people completely miss. Prayer is how you speak to God, but intuition is how God speaks back. Many cry and pray, "Show me the way. Tell me what to do." Yet, when the answer comes in a still, small voice, they brush it aside as imagination. They ask for a sign, and then ignore the sign. They pray for direction, but cling to their own reasoning. But I tell you plainly, your reasoning mind is Pharaoh, hardening the heart. Your intuition is Moses leading you out of Egypt. Which voice will you follow? Let me show you the difference. A woman once came to me with only $8. By reason, she should have stayed in New York to find work, but her intuition whispered, "Go home." It seemed foolish. She had just enough for car fare. Yet, she obeyed. And when she arrived, she reconnected with an old friend of her family. And through that connection, she received thousands of dollars, in the most unexpected way. Had she followed reason, she would have struggled. By following intuition, she prospered. Another woman was traveling by ship when a thick fog brought everything to a halt. Reason said, "It is weather. Nothing can be done." But intuition whispered, "There are no fogs in divine mind." She declared, "I give thanks for the sun." And soon the fog lifted, the sun shone, and the ship sailed on. Even in the little things, intuition leads to increase. I remember going out to buy 2 articles. There were 2 shops, one more expensive, the other cheaper. Reason said, "Go to the cheaper shop." Intuition whispered, "Go to the expensive one." I obeyed, and when I arrived, I found the 2 items were being sold for the price of one. If I had gone to the cheaper store, I would have paid twice as much. Do you see? Intuition always guides to the perfect outcome. Now, why does this matter? Because the world has trained you to mistrust your inner voice. You've been told to analyze, to reason, to plan, to calculate. But reason sees only appearances, while intuition sees the divine design. Reason builds bricks without straw, but intuition parts the Red Sea. Reason trembles before lions, but intuition shuts their mouths. Reason circles Jericho, but intuition knows when to shout. So, how do you cultivate intuition? First, by asking and expecting. Before sleep, declare, "When I wake, I shall know exactly what to do." And in the morning, act on the first clear hunch you receive. That is the language of the spirit. Second, by silencing the chatter of doubt. Intuition speaks softly. Fear shouts. The more you practice listening, the clearer it becomes. Third, by instant obedience. Do not argue, do not delay. When intuition speaks, move. Now, you might be thinking, "But Florence, what if I mistake my own wishful thinking for intuition?" Here is the test. True intuition is calm, not anxious. It brings peace, not pressure. It opens doors. It does not slam them. It aligns with divine order and brings results that bless, not bind. So let us speak together. I am divinely sensitive to my intuitive leads. I give instant obedience to the still small voice. I am guided, guarded, and governed every step of the way. Feel the peace in those words. That is the vibration of guidance. That is the magic path. And here is the golden thread. Your prosperity, your health, your love, your perfect self-expression. All of it unfolds by intuition. For there is a design for your life, a perfect pattern already finished in the divine mind. And your intuition is the compass that leads you straight to it. You do not have to force. You do not have to scheme. You do not have to beg. You have only to listen, obey, and walk the path that opens before you. Now you see why I call it the magic path. It is the shortest distance between you and your good. It is the beeline to your demonstration. And once you step onto it, you will never go back to the long road of struggle. That is powerful enough on its own. But combine it with everything we have spoken tonight: smashing the false record, inscribing prosperity, dissolving fear, shouting down walls, and you will understand why I say you have been completely rewired. For now you walk not by sight, but by truth, not by fear, but by faith, not by reason, but by intuition. Now you have walked with me through the whole journey. You have smashed the false record and erased the old grooves of fear and lack. You have inscribed the new record of prosperity, spoken in faith until money itself must obey your word. You have dissolved fear, the only enemy, and stood fearless before lions, finding angels in armor. You have shouted down the walls of Jericho, stepped through the secret door of success, and discovered the key that guides you forever, the magic path of intuition. So I tell you tonight, you have been rewired, not by effort, not by striving, but by the word of truth, which never returns void. You are not the same as when you pressed play. The vibration of lack has been broken. The habit of fear has been dissolved. The chains of discouragement have been shattered. A new record is playing now. The record of health, wealth, love, and perfect self-expression. Say it with me one last time. I now see clearly. I am fearless, I am prosperous, I am guided. My perfect life, my divine design unfolds now under grace in perfect ways. Let that affirmation ring through your mind and body. Let it be the song you carry into sleep, the melody that wakes you in the morning. For the word you have heard tonight is not passing sound. It is law, and law fulfilled is demonstration. If you are hearing my voice in this very moment, you have not stumbled upon these words by accident. You have not clicked upon this message because of whim or wandering curiosity. You have been divinely appointed to hear this truth. You have been marked from the foundation of the world to awaken to your millionaire destiny. There are no accidents in the realm of spirit. Everything that happens in your life is the outworking of divine law. Even the detours, even the delays, even the disappointments you have known have been carefully woven to lead you to this hour, to this voice, to this divine decree. I speak not to the doubter, not to the scoffer, not to the casual hearer who glances at truth and walks away unchanged. No, this message carries the vibration of destiny. And only those whom heaven has chosen to rise into wealth, to step into abundance, to inherit the kingdom already prepared for them, will feel its pull. It is as though a lighthouse has shone through the darkness, and only your ship was positioned to see its beam. Others may pass by unaware, but your spirit recognizes it. Your soul knows it, and you cannot turn away. For the call of divine wealth has reached you, and will not be silenced. The world has long told you a lie, a bitter lie wrapped in appearances and fear. A lie that says wealth is earned by endless toil, by ruthless competition, by scrambling up some fragile ladder built by men who fear lack as much as they chase riches. They told you that abundance belongs to others, that fortune favors a chosen few, while you must settle for scraps, while you must labor, strive, hope, and perhaps never taste true freedom. But I tell you, by the authority of divine law, heaven does not forget its own. There is no wealth in the visible world that does not first exist in the unseen. There is no millionaire fortune that was not first spoken into substance by the word, no palace that was not first constructed in consciousness, no treasure that was not first claimed in spirit. What is yours cannot be stolen. What belongs to you by divine right cannot be lost. And the riches marked with your name cannot be given to another. Though appearances may have told you otherwise, though years may have passed without proof, though you may have felt hidden, overlooked, rejected, or denied, none of it has moved the eternal truth of your destiny. The scroll of heaven still holds your fortune complete, and no hand on earth can tear it away. Listen closely, for this is the law of life. You are already wealthy in divine mind. You already possess the fortune you seek. You already walk the halls of abundance in the unseen. Your task is not to become worthy. Your task is not to claw your way upward through fear and striving. Your task is to awaken, to recognize, to decree, and to allow heaven's perfect supply to manifest for you under grace in perfect ways. The beggar prays and waits and wonders why the answer does not come. But the awakened soul speaks with authority, decrees the thing, and it is established unto them. The subconscious mind, that faithful servant, takes every word you speak, every image you hold, and it builds your outer world according to your inner decree. If you have spoken lack, you have built walls of lack. If you have imagined delay, you have tied your own blessings in knots. But if you will speak wealth, if you will imagine fortune, if you will decree abundance as your present reality, nothing on earth or in heaven can withhold it from you. This is not wishful thinking. This is the spiritual science that governs all creation. Thou shalt also decree a thing, and it shall be established unto thee. So I speak now to the chosen ones, to the destined millionaires whom heaven has summoned to hear this voice. I tell you, your waiting is over. Your wandering is ended. The walls of lack and limitation crumble even now, and the gates of your promised land swing wide. Your fortune is not ahead of you in some far-off day of striving. It is here, it is now. It is already complete in the realm of spirit. Say this with me as a decree, not as a plead. I am marked for wealth. My supply is unlimited. My fortune is established now. Divine riches rush to me in perfect ways, by perfect channels through divine right action, that no man can block. Say it and know it. For heaven moves on the word of faith. And your millionaire destiny begins the moment you dare to speak it as already yours. Divine timing is never late and never hurried. It is the unfolding of heaven's perfect pattern in your life. And because of that, you could not have found this message a moment too soon, or a moment too late. Your human mind may have thought you have been delayed, that life has passed you by, that opportunities have closed their doors. But spiritual law declares that nothing has been lost, nothing has been stolen, and everything that belongs to you, by divine right, has been carefully preserved, waiting for the hour when you would awaken and receive it. In my years of teaching these truths, I have seen countless souls who thought they were finished, thought their window of blessing had closed, thought they had missed their chance for abundance, only to watch heaven sweep away the dust of defeat and bring forth rivers in the desert. Miracles of provision that astonished every reasoning mind. I recall a woman who wandered into my studio weary and burdened with debt, convinced she had no hope. She told me she had tried every method, labored for years, yet life rewarded her only with lack. I said to her, "Your struggle has been but the shadow dance of fear. Divine supply needs no struggle. Heaven has not forgotten you, and heaven is never late." I spoke the word for her that day, and within weeks, money that had been locked away for years was released. Channels she had never imagined opened to her, and she found herself walking through doors of provision that had always been hers, but had been hidden until the appointed hour. This is how divine guidance works. It leads you without maps, without signs, without fanfare, yet perfectly, surely, inevitably to your good. Many of you have wondered why your path has wound through deserts and storms, why people have walked away, why ventures have failed, why your efforts seemed fruitless. But spiritual law shows us that every detour, every loss, every shut door was heaven's invisible hand, steering you away from the counterfeit toward the true. We do not see the full design while we walk through its threads. We only see fragments that appear tangled, unjust, or cruel. But in the higher vision, every step has been a necessary chord in the symphony of your millionaire destiny. Nothing has been wasted. The rejection that wounded you drove you closer to your true fortune. The failures that shamed you broke the hold of false dependence and opened the space for divine supply to flow. Even your deepest valleys have been preparations for mountaintop abundance. All things work together for good to them that love God. And you, chosen one, have been carried along that current, even when you thought yourself lost. From this moment forward, you must abandon the belief that you are delayed, that you are behind, that wealth belongs to others while you are left out. Divine timing is precise and divine guidance is unfailing. Begin to declare it. I am always in the right place at the right time. Nothing is withheld from me. My channels of supply are divinely selected and divinely timed. Riches flow to me without obstruction. Say it until your heart believes it. For as you decree it, the subconscious aligns with it, and the invisible guides move you effortlessly into visible abundance. Opportunities long hidden will surface. Doors you never knocked upon will swing open. And what once seemed impossible will arrive as naturally as dawn follows night. This is the law of divine order. Nothing is random and nothing is lost. When you recognize this law and trust it fully, fear loses its power to rule you. Anxiety about missing your chance dissolves, and in its place rises a calm authority that draws fortune like a magnet. You begin to see that every so-called coincidence is heaven's arrangement. Every meeting divinely appointed, every step ordered by unseen wisdom that knows the exact path to your wealth. You awaken to a new truth: my fortune is inevitable. My millionaire destiny certain. My supply already complete. No man, no system, no circumstance can rob me of it. For heaven is my source and divine timing delivers it perfectly. Speak it boldly now: I am led by Spirit. I cannot miss my good. My wealth is divinely timed, divinely guided, divinely guaranteed. Hidden within you. Beneath the layers of doubt that years of fear and struggle have draped upon your mind. Beneath the stories that others have told you about who you are and what you may have. Beneath every false belief that wealth is only for others and never for you. There exists an eternal identity that cannot be erased, an invisible millionaire, self already alive in divine mind, waiting for you to awaken to it. Waiting for you to recognize what heaven has already declared to be true about you. Waiting for you to step into the garments of wealth consciousness that were tailored for you before you ever drew breath upon this earth. This identity is not something you earn. It is not a rank you achieve through human labor. It is not granted by men who measure worth by coins and titles and fleeting applause. No, this identity is sealed by Spirit. It is stamped with the authority of divine law. And though you may have walked for years in the rags of limitation, though you may have spoken the words of poverty and seen them reflected in your affairs, though you may have wandered as a stranger in foreign lands of debt and deprivation, you have never ceased to be the heir of riches, the possessor of an invisible fortune that even now surrounds you like an untapped mine of gold and silver waiting to be claimed. Understand this. The world hides your true inheritance not because heaven is cruel or withholding, but because spiritual law requires recognition before manifestation. It demands acknowledgement before release. It awaits your spoken decree to open the vaults of divine supply. Just as a king's son may be carried off as a child and raised in obscurity, never knowing his royal birthright, until the appointed moment when the crown is revealed and the throne restored, so have you lived beneath your station. So have you walked as though fortune belonged to others, while the kingdom of wealth has always been yours. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom, said the Master. Not merely the scraps of survival, not meager rations to keep you crawling through life, but the entire kingdom of abundance, the limitless treasures of divine provision, the boundless riches of heaven's storehouse. These are already yours, unseen perhaps, but not unreal, invisible to the doubting eye, yet fully formed in spirit, awaiting only the moment when you awaken and declare, I am wealthy now. My supply is unlimited. I receive the riches prepared for me from the beginning of time. But herein lies the great deception. that delays wealth for so many. They believe they must first become worthy. They believe they must prove themselves through sweat and striving and suffering. They believe that lack is a sign of unworthiness, and that only when they have repaid some unknown debt to fate will fortune finally smile upon them. This is the lie of poverty consciousness, the counterfeit law of struggle that has kept countless souls enslaved to fear. Divine law does not require toil. It does not require pleading. It does not require long seasons of deprivation to teach you how to receive. It requires only recognition. The seed of wealth is already planted within you, fully formed and perfect in the superconscious mind. And like every seed, it does not grow by force. It does not ripen because you worry over it or whip it into life. It grows because you recognize that it is already alive, already complete, already containing within itself the full harvest. The oak is not added to the acorn by labor. It is revealed as the acorn unfolds in the soil of recognition. So too is your millionaire identity, revealed not by endless effort, but by speaking the word of truth, by seeing yourself as heaven sees you, by clothing your consciousness in wealth, and refusing to speak lack another day of your life. Therefore I tell you, stop striving to become a millionaire, and begin decreeing that you already are one. Stop imagining yourself as one who must climb and claw toward abundance, and begin imagining yourself as one who already possesses it. Stop allowing the world to name you poor, limited, overlooked, and begin naming yourself rich, abundant, irresistible to divine supply. Say it now with all authority. I am already wealthy in divine mind. I walk in the riches of heaven. My fortune is established and now manifests under grace in perfect ways. Speak it as a decree. For life and death are in the power of the tongue. And as you speak, so shall it be established unto you. The unseen forces of wealth respond not to longing or desperation, but to recognition and command. When you speak wealth as present reality, heaven hears its own voice echoed back and rushes to fulfill its word. Channels of provision open that no human effort could have forced. Opportunities appear that seemed impossible, and riches long prepared for you flow in avalanches of abundance. You do not become wealthy. You awaken to the wealth that has always been yours. And when you do, the world must bow to that unseen authority. People who once overlooked you will now be drawn to you. Doors that stood closed will open as though invisible hands turned the keys. Circumstances that resisted you will now obey you. For your outer world cannot defy the inner decree. You are the hidden millionaire unveiled, the royal heir restored to the throne, the child of divine riches stepping into the estate that no thief could steal. No judge could deny, no circumstance could revoke. This is your true self, and this is the hour to claim it. Stand tall in spirit and declare, I am wealthy now. I walk in unseen riches. My supply is limitless and visible to me now. The law of divine abundance clothes me in fortune, crowns me with prosperity, and establishes me in unshakable wealth. Heaven rejoices in my fortune, and the earth yields to my decree. The greatest lie that has ever wrapped itself around the human mind and strangled the flow of divine riches is this poisonous whisper that says you must first become worthy before heaven will trust you with abundance. That you must earn, sweat, sacrifice, and perhaps even suffer long before you can be entrusted with wealth. That you must somehow qualify for what has already been written in your name from eternity. And because this lie has been repeated by families and churches and schools, and echoed by the collective thought of the fearful world, generations of souls have lived and died believing they were unfit for divine inheritance. Believing that wealth was reserved for others, for the chosen few, for those born under a certain star, or with a certain privilege, never realizing that their own words and beliefs were chaining them to lack, never realizing that heaven was waiting all along to pour out riches that required no proving, no struggle, no grinding toil, only the recognition of divine sonship, only the fearless decree that says, I am already supplied. My fortune is secure, and by spiritual law, nothing can withhold it from me. A poverty consciousness has been taught as a virtue in many places. As though there is some honor in shrinking from abundance, as though humility requires walking in lack, as though divine love would ever will deprivation for its own children. But I tell you, heaven knows no poverty. The kingdom contains no lack, and the infinite storehouse of divine supply has no gates marked restricted for certain souls. Every belief that says wealth corrupts, every saying that money is evil, every thought that riches must be wrestled from the clenched fist of fate is a false law. A counterfeit decree that has been allowed to run rampant in human consciousness, shaping lives of limitation because men have not known the power of their own words. Your spoken word is law. It is the scepter by which you rule your world, and when you speak lack, when you confess unworthiness, when you agree with fear, you create conditions that match those declarations. You build invisible walls that block fortune. You bind yourself to the chains of scarcity and call it reality. Yet it is only the shadow of a false decree. The truth, the eternal unchanging truth, is that you are permanently funded by divine law, eternally backed by invisible riches, and sustained by a supply that cannot fail. You were born fully financed by heaven, and nothing in time or space can cancel that cosmic endowment. The richest man on earth is but a poor imitator of the wealth that is already yours in spirit. The diamonds and gold of the world are mere dust compared to the infinite river of provision that flows unseen but ever present for you. It is not your labor that creates wealth. It is not your cleverness, your education, your human connections. Wealth is spiritual substance, and it is released into your life by decree, by recognition, by the fearless word of faith that declares your millionaire destiny as a present and unshakable fact. All that the Father hath is mine, said the Master, and that same truth is spoken to you now. All of heaven's fortune is yours. It is your Father's good pleasure to give it to you. And you dishonor divine law when you believe that you must crawl for what was given freely, when you believe you must bargain and beg for what was yours before you asked. So let this false belief be shattered now. Stand up in spirit and renounce every word you have ever spoken that agreed with lack. Every thought that said, I cannot afford it. Every fear that whispered, I am unworthy of wealth. Every sigh of defeat that said, perhaps one day, but not for me, not now. Smash these lies with the hammer of divine truth and say boldly, I am permanently funded by divine law. My supply is limitless, immediate, and perfect. I am supported by the infinite riches of spirit. I am wealthy now under grace in perfect ways. Speak it until your very bones vibrate with the rhythm of abundance. Speak it until your subconscious throws off every chain of poverty and opens wide the gates of fortune. Speak it until invisible channels of supply spring open, like fountains bursting through stone, and pour into your life treasures that no human effort could have secured. Do not merely hope for it. Do not merely dream of it. Do not merely wish for wealth someday. Decree it now as the spiritual fact that it is. Your wealth is not delayed. It is only unseen because you have not recognized it. Like an unopened letter containing a fortune, your supply has waited patiently for you to break the seal with your word of faith. When you declare your permanent funding by divine law, when you stand in the authority of spiritual sonship and speak as one who has already received, the letter is opened. The unseen riches become visible. Opportunities arrive without strain. Money flows without toil, and every appearance of lack evaporates like morning mist before the sun. This is the law of wealth. You do not chase it, you command it. You do not labor endlessly for it, you align with it. You do not beg for it, you speak it into visibility. For your fortune is already complete, already yours, already guaranteed by heaven itself. Millionaires who stride through the avenues of the world with apparent ease, who sign papers and close deals and build empires that others marvel at and envy, are not often aware that they are practicing spiritual law. They do not sit in quiet meditation, reading metaphysical texts. They do not always kneel in prayer, asking heaven to guide their every step. Yet unknowingly, they align with principles that heaven cannot deny. Unknowingly, they walk in assumptions and declarations that compel fortune to flow toward them, like iron filings to a magnet. Unknowingly, they speak words of certainty that strike the subconscious like bolts of lightning carving channels through which wealth rushes to meet them. They may tell you it is hard work or clever strategy or simply luck. Yet beneath every outward explanation is an inner cause they do not see, a spiritual posture they have assumed without conscious thought. And it is that posture, not the labor of their hands, that has drawn riches to them. Watch closely the man who becomes wealthy, seemingly without effort. He speaks with authority. His words carry the ring of inevitability. He declares success long before evidence appears. He walks as though doors must open for him. He expects provision before it is visible, and by these unknowing decrees, he bends the unseen to his will. The law of assumption is at work within him. What he assumes as true becomes true, not because of privilege or favoritism, but because spiritual law responds only to belief, only to the images impressed upon the subconscious by spoken word and unwavering thought. He may not know that every word is a wand and every belief a seed that must bear fruit. He may not know that the invisible world rearranges itself to match the inner decree. Yet he benefits all the same, for divine law operates whether we understand it or not. It is impartial. It is unchanging. It is as exact as mathematics. And it delivers abundance to the one who assumes abundance and decrees it as his rightful state. I recall a businessman who came to me, not as a student of truth, but seeking counsel for what he called uncanny good fortune. He told me that every venture he touched seemed to prosper. Every idea he launched brought returns beyond expectation while others around him failed despite equal or greater effort. He asked me why he was so lucky, why fortune seemed to favor him. I asked him how he approached his work, and without hesitation he said, "I always expect it to succeed. I never think about failure. When others hesitate, I move forward already counting the profit as mine." There it was. His fortune did not spring from markets or timing or labor. It sprang from the law of consciousness, from the inner decree of success that he spoke and believed without resistance. The wealth he carried in mind was simply mirrored by his affairs. He was without knowing it practicing the law that many strive for years to learn. Life becomes what you believe it to be, and fortune is drawn to the mind that assumes it has already received. This is why I say to you, chosen one, you must awaken and do deliberately what others do unconsciously. You must speak with greater authority than the unknowing millionaire. You must decree wealth with conscious faith, rather than blind assumption. You must see yourself not merely as one hoping to join the ranks of abundance, but as one who already stands among the spiritually rich, whose fortune is not fragile or fleeting, but established on divine law that no market crash, no human opinion, no turn of fate can ever dismantle. When you do this, you surpass the worldly millionaire. For you do not build your house upon sand, trusting in chance and circumstance. You build upon the eternal rock of spiritual law. And the wealth that comes to you cannot be shaken, cannot be stolen, cannot be lost. For it is anchored in the invisible, sustained by heaven, and flows to you through channels no earthly force can close. And let this truth settle deep within you. Moral worthiness, as the world defines it, does not dictate the flow of wealth. The law does not ask if you are saint or sinner, deserving or undeserving before it responds to your belief. It responds only to the decree, only to the spoken word backed by faith. This is why you have seen men of questionable character accumulate fortunes while good, honest souls struggle in lack. They each receive according to consciousness, according to the seeds they sow in word and thought, according to the law that cannot be mocked. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. But you, awakened soul, you who have been chosen to hear this voice, must not be deceived into thinking that you must forsake goodness to gain riches. No, when you align with divine law consciously, when you speak wealth as a decree of heaven's justice, your fortune is not tainted by greed or fear or falsehood. It is clean. It is pure. It is drawn from the infinite storehouse of spirit, and arrives clothed in grace, blessing you and all it touches. Therefore, take hold of this unseen scepter of authority now, speak as the true millionaire you are. Declare boldly, I expect success in everything I do. Large sums of money flow to me freely and endlessly. Divine opportunities appear before me without delay. I walk in wealth that cannot be hindered, cannot be blocked, cannot be lost. My fortune is anchored in divine law, and manifests now under grace in perfect ways. As you decree this daily with rhythm and certainty, you activate within you the very posture that unknowing millionaires stumble upon by accident. But unlike them, your wealth is not chance, your abundance is not fragile, your fortune is not temporary, it is deliberate, it is divine, it is eternal. And it grows richer with every word of truth you speak. There comes a moment in the journey of every soul marked for fortune, when the veil of limitation begins to tremble, when the unseen hands of heaven reach down and shake the slumbering mind. When life itself seems to turn and whisper, in ways you cannot ignore, saying, "Wake, you sleeping hare. Arise and take what is yours." And though the world around you may not yet show a single glimmer of gold, or the faintest sign of change, something deep within begins to stir like a royal bloodline, suddenly remembering its crown, like a lost child suddenly feeling the pull of home. And this stirring is no accident, no fleeting mood, no empty wish. It is the call of spirit summoning you to recognize who you truly are. To remember that you were never meant to grovel in lack. Never meant to scramble for crumbs. Never meant to live beneath your divine station. But have always been destined to reign in abundance, to walk clothed in the majesty of wealth consciousness, to live as a visible demonstration of heaven's endless provision on earth. I have often said that most men live like heirs of a vast fortune, locked away in a vault whose combination they have forgotten, wandering outside in rags, convinced they are paupers, while unimaginable riches sit untouched within reach. And because they do not know the law, because they do not remember their divine right, they never even try the door. Yet when the call comes, and if you are hearing my voice, it has surely come. It is as if the lock begins to click of its own accord. As if unseen forces whisper the forgotten numbers to your soul. As if the sealed vault begins to open without effort, revealing treasures that had always been yours. This awakening cannot be forced by human striving. It is not the product of logic or education. It is the movement of spirit itself. For divine timing has deemed the hour ripe, for you to know yourself as heaven knows you, for you to recognize your true wealth, for you to stop playing the beggar, and step boldly into your millionaire destiny. So many sleep through their inheritance, because they believe life is only what they see with their eyes. Because they judge their worth by their bank account, their titles, their earthly status, never realizing that what they see is only the echo of what they have decreed. That the visible is only the shadow of the invisible. That their true treasure is hidden within, waiting for their recognition to call it forth. But you, chosen one, cannot sleep any longer. The trumpet has sounded. The walls of illusion begin to fall. And the spirit within cries out to you with words that do not fade awake. Thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light. The Christ consciousness within you, the awareness of divine wealth, the knowing that you are one with infinite supply, the realization that heaven and earth are aligned to prosper you. This is the light that dawns in awakening. This is the torch that reveals the riches long prepared for you. This is the power that shakes the chains of lack and calls you into dominion over your financial world. Many fear this awakening because it demands that they cast aside every excuse for lack, every identity tied to struggle, every habit of speaking words of defeat. It feels safer to remain in familiar poverty than to step into unknown abundance, for wealth consciousness requires courage. The courage to speak riches when appearances scream lack. The courage to walk as a king while the world still calls you common. The courage to decree prosperity while your hands are yet empty. Yet this is precisely how the sleeping heir rises into dominion, by answering the call, by aligning his word with heaven's word, by refusing to bow to appearances, and instead walking by the unseen law that says all that the Father hath is mine now. The moment you answer this call with faith, unseen legions move on your behalf. Channels of provision that lay dormant begin to open. Opportunities long delayed rush forward. Wealth that was hidden beneath layers of fear and false belief bursts forth like a river breaking through a dam, and life itself begins to bow to the authority of your spoken word. So I say to you now, do not silence this call. Do not return to slumber. Do not believe the old lie that says you must wait for some future time to be rich. The awakening is now. The fortune is now. The divine pattern of your millionaire destiny is complete now. Begin to answer the call with your words. I awake to my divine wealth. I see through the illusion of lack. I am the heir of infinite riches. Channels of supply open to me now. My millionaire destiny is sealed and manifests in perfect ways. Speak it morning and night. Speak it when doubts arise. Speak it when the world challenges your faith. For every time you speak it, you sound the trumpet that brings down the walls of limitation. You summon unseen helpers to prepare your path. You align with the eternal truth that heaven has marked you for wealth. And as surely as dawn follows night, as surely as the seed bursts from the soil into blossom, as surely as divine law cannot fail, you will rise from the sleep of poverty into the daylight of your millionaire inheritance. And all the world shall witness what heaven has always known. You were never poor. You were never without supply. You were never forsaken. You were simply asleep to your divine riches. And now you are awake. When the sleeping heir finally stirs, and the sound of awakening echoes through the chambers of the subconscious mind, when you begin to sense that there is more to you than struggle and scarcity, and you catch even the faintest glimpse of your millionaire destiny waiting just beyond the veil of appearance, you must do more than merely think of wealth or wish for prosperity. You must speak it into being with a voice that carries the authority of heaven itself. For words are the bridges between the invisible and the visible. Words are the chisels that carve divine substance into form. Words are the wands of magic that command riches to take shape in your affairs. And until you take hold of this power and use it deliberately, you remain like a king with a sealed decree in his hand, who never speaks it aloud, and thus never sees his realm obey. This is why I tell you now that there is a spoken wealth formula, a spiritual incantation that has brought rivers of gold into the lives of countless souls who dared to declare it with conviction. A decree that strikes the subconscious like thunder and sends ripples through the unseen, rearranging circumstances, drawing opportunities, and compelling supply to flow from directions no reasoning mind could have orchestrated. The formula is simple yet laden with power that cannot be exhausted. Large sums of money come to me, now under grace in perfect ways. When you first speak these words, your human mind may scoff. Your reason may sneer. Your outer world may present only debts and delays and deficiencies. But divine law does not heed appearances. It responds only to decree. And when you repeat this formula rhythmically, consistently, with unwavering belief, you set in motion forces that cannot be stopped. The subconscious mind, that faithful but impressionable servant, begins to picture you as wealthy, begins to align with fortune, begins to expect abundance. And because the subconscious is the bridge to the divine mind, what you impress upon it cannot fail to appear in your experience. It may arrive as sudden gifts, as unexpected opportunities, as contracts or inheritances or ideas that burst with golden potential, but arrive it must. For spiritual law is exact, and the spoken word never returns void. I recall the story of a man bound in chains of poverty for years, laboring long hours, yet never seeing more than enough to survive, until he learned this formula, and with desperate faith that burned brighter than his fear, began to declare it daily, not timidly, but as one who knew he was issuing commands to the universe itself. He walked the streets, whispering it under his breath. He spoke it upon waking and before sleep. He shouted it silently against the noise of his doubts. Large sums of money come to me now under grace in perfect ways. At first nothing changed, and those around him mocked his declarations. But he persisted, for he understood that spiritual seeds require time to root and blossom. Then, without warning, money began to appear from places unseen. Old debts repaid, forgotten investments maturing, opportunities offered without solicitation. Gifts flowing from unexpected quarters, until his life was transformed from hand to mouth survival into a steady stream of provision that seemed almost miraculous to those who watched. Yet there was no miracle in the sense of chance. It was divine law obeying a spoken command. It was heaven responding to a decree of faith. It was the invisible treasury of spirit opening its vaults. Because a rightful heir had finally spoken the key. This formula works not because it is magic words strung together in superstition, but because it aligns perfectly with spiritual principles. It acknowledges abundance as present and available now. It releases the human impulse to force results, and instead trusts the grace of divine timing. And it declares that the channels through which wealth arrives shall be perfect, harmonious, and free from harm. Every phrase carries vibration. Large sums of money impresses the mind with magnitude and possibility. Come to me now establishes immediacy and certainty. Under grace ensures that the flow is lawful, safe, and just, and in perfect ways guarantees that what arrives is fitting, beneficial, and aligned with the divine plan of your life. Speak these words as though you were a general commanding an army of unseen forces. As though you were a king issuing an unbreakable edict. As though you were heaven itself, declaring truth into manifestation. And watch how swiftly life bends to obey the rhythm of your decree. But do not merely speak it once, and return to the language of lack. For that is like planting a seed, and then digging it up each day to see if it has sprouted. You must speak it until it saturates your subconscious, until your very cells hum with the vibration of wealth, until your thoughts naturally align with riches, until you can no longer imagine poverty as part of your story. When fear whispers, answer with the formula. When bills arrive, answer with the formula. When others around you speak limitation silently or aloud, answer with the formula. Let it become the pulse of your inner life. Let it echo like a drum beat that marches you steadily toward your fortune. Let it resound so strongly within that no outer appearance of lack can shake your confidence. Understand this. When you speak this formula, you are not asking heaven to give you something it has withheld. You are not begging a distant power to take pity on you. You are claiming what is already yours. Unlocking the invisible channels of divine supply that have waited patiently for your recognition. Shaking the dust off fortunes long prepared with your name engraved upon them. Spiritual wealth is eternal and unmovable. And when you speak with authority, you step into alignment with that eternal truth. Like a radio tuning into a broadcast that has been playing all along, your words tune your consciousness to the frequency of abundance. And suddenly you hear, see, and receive what was always present, but unheard, unseen, and unreceived before. So I say to you now, Take up this formula and wield it like a sword of light, cutting through every shadow of poverty, every wall of lack, every knot of fear. Declare it boldly. Declare it rhythmically. Declare it with unshakable knowing. Large sums of money come to me now under grace in perfect ways. As you do, watch how the invisible begins to move. Watch how divine order arranges circumstances. Watch how channels of wealth you never imagined spring open. Watch how opportunities arrive without struggle. And watch how fortune, already yours in spirit, manifests visibly in ways that leave no doubt that heaven has marked you for riches. This is not fantasy, it is law, and law never fails those who dare to speak it with faith. Let me finish with the final truth that seals all we have spoken. Your words today become your wealth tomorrow. Every declaration you make is a spiritual investment that pays dividends in your experience. Every time you choose to speak abundance over lack, blessing over cursing, faith over fear, you are writing checks that divine law must honor. The voice that speaks wealth becomes wealthy. The tongue that declares abundance experiences abundance. The mouth that confesses prosperity demonstrates prosperity. This is the unbreakable law of the spoken word, and it is working in your life right now. So, I leave you with this charge: speak only what you want to multiply. Declare only what you want to manifest. Confess only what you want to experience. For your words are the seeds of your tomorrow, and tomorrow is coming whether you plant consciously or unconsciously. Make this your final decree, your sacred commitment, your unbreakable vow from this day forward. I speak only prosperity. I declare only abundance. I confess only wealth. My words create my world, and my world is rich beyond measure. Say it now. Believe it now. Live it now. For the law is already in motion. And your millionaire destiny is already sealed by the power of your spoken word.